Welcome to the Divine Counsel Worldview podcast. Today's discussion is in the Gospel of John, chapter 2. We're going to handle verses 13 to 22. This will be Jesus going into the temple, apparently early on in his ministry, and cleansing the temple, as we call it. So let's handle that today. And we're going to get into, Mike, the conversation. Here's where I'd like to take it from a DCW point of view. Again, we can handle the miracle or the story, I think, rather quickly. But what I'd like to take this conversation into is Jesus' relationship to the temple, clearly, the state of the temple at that time in Jesus' life, and then Jesus' larger relationship to the law. And in fact, Mike, let me ask this on an opening, again, spontaneous reaction here from you. Here's why I think this question of John 2, verses 13 to 22 can be a DCW podcast, and that is Jesus' relationship to the law does have ultimate meaning, in my opinion, to a divine counsel worldview. And here's how. And let me give it to you on the fly. You tell me if you, how, just react. Let's go to the end of the story. And again, Dr. Heiser wrote a book near the end of his life called What Does God Want? And I liked it because, and many people asked for this kind of thing, because they were coming to Mike's ministry, podcast, his videos and so forth, saying, where does this go? I mean, what's the point of seeing the Bible in this light? And so he wrote the book to say, folks, I am a convinced evangelical in love with Jesus Christ, and I want to show you why this makes a difference. And the book, What Does God Want?, basically answers that question. To summarize it for us, he comes up with the basic idea, and I totally agree with it. God wants a family. God doesn't want to create a group of people that just behave a certain way, that live a certain lifestyle. He wants a family. And that's why you have the sons of God concept in the Old Testament and the sons of God, children of God concept in the New. So his basic point is that God is putting together a family, right? Now think through the logic of that idea. And here's why I think we could say the law issue in Jesus' own life is a DCW issue. Thinking backwards, how do you create a family? You don't do it through laws, right? Think of your own family. Why do you have a family? Because you're related. You have a shared story. You even have shared traditions, but it's not because you force people to act a certain way. It's because they simply think a certain way, and they have, shall we say, ancestral ties to a family line. Well, and loyalty. Think of how loyalty works. Blood is thicker than water, as we say. What does that mean? It means that family ties always come back to, shall we say, haunt us. We want to be loyal to someone outside the family, but here's every mobster movie, right, ever made. It comes down to who do you belong to, right? So could it be, and here's where Mike was going, and again, I totally agree, that what God is doing is creating a family of loyalists, and that loyalty is family-driven, not behaviorally driven. Now, how do you create that? Think again backwards. Or why can this work in the life of the Bible, New Testament, and even the life of Jesus, is because loyalty can be done by anybody. You don't have to be a Jew to be loyal to Yahweh. You can do it as a Gentile. You can be a Cornelius and be loyal. So the story is going, again, from backwards to forwards. If God's after a family, he does that through loyalty. Loyalty can be done by anyone. Therefore, now, if you think backwards enough, you can say, I bet you those laws that we were given in the Old Testament, think, ritual laws, traditions, kosher, dietary issues, or circumcision, whatever, that would therefore probably be less important, because if loyalty is important, that makes the laws less important. So here's my point. It would be consistent to me to meet a Messiah in the New Testament, a Jewish Messiah of all things, who emphasized loyalty above law. That would be consistent with the story in the end. Now, granted, a lot of people didn't see that story on the ground during the days of Jesus, even the disciples. So they're going to be frustrated, John 4, when Jesus talks to a Samaritan woman. But Jesus, knowing the end of the story, that loyalty is where God's been going the whole time to create a family, thus allows us to now think backwards and say, it wouldn't be inconsistent to see Jesus downplaying law, because in that sense, you don't need law to become part of the family. I hope that's not too much too quick, but that's where I'm going with this. And that's why I think it's a DCW issue. Jesus' relationship to the law ultimately is part of a divine counsel worldview, because we have to remember that on the back end, on the final, scene of the play, we are there as a family, not as a group of law-abiding people. What do you think?
Well, if I don't know if it's pushback, I would maybe just want to appendix or add additional thoughts to this, because I think you have it typically, especially within evangelicalism, which is it's an offshoot of Protestantism. Mm-hmm. We gravitate towards one extreme or the other on the spectrum. Either the law is completely useful and we have to abide by it as much as possible, or we find ways to explain why certain laws are no longer important, or we go to the other extreme in that it's nice that we have the Old Testament, but you don't need to read it. You don't need to learn anything from it. It's pretty much moot. And I think the conversation is that even the fact that we're using the word law with our modern understanding of Western society, that itself is already like a misstep. We're already stumbling over our feet.
You're totally right. Law and Torah do not match very well.
Yeah, because and a few other things like I would just point out is that instruction from an ancient Near Eastern perspective was not so much about legalistic law. It was to show, wow, how wise is your monarch? How wise or endowed with the God's power and wisdom is your monarch? And so you would have Hammurabi, who would have, Hammurabi's laws and, an eye for an eye. Like, wow, that's a really wise saying. And you then see Yahweh giving his law. And much of this is like in case study of, hey, if you have a certain circumstance, this and this and this, then here's how you should proceed to go about it. It's not so much of like, this is what you need to do. This is about when you encounter a situation similar to this, or maybe sometimes exactly like this. Yep. How are you supposed to think about it as my people? If we're a family, how are my family going to approach this kind of problem? And even last week, my lead pastor, and he says it was partly because I suggested it and he wasn't sure if I was actually giving him a challenge. I suggested, why don't we, preach a sermon one day that's based on Numbers 5 of the test that's given to a woman that's accused of adultery, of being unfaithful. But but it basically turns into a he said, she said scenario. Mm-hmm. And so what can we learn from this story? And one of the cool things about this story is not so much of, hey, this is exactly what you need to do for a woman that has to be put into a trial by fire, but more of, do you not see and realize this is a defenseless woman who is accused by her husband, who is jealous that she is unfaithful, and yet there's no proof, there's no evidence, there's no witnesses. So who's the only one who can actually arbitrate the truth? Only Yahweh.
Right. She
has to stand before Yahweh, drink a muddy water concoction, and yet in the end, he's the one that knows whether she was unfaithful or not. She stands before him alone, not the priest, not her husband, not a trial of other men. And like that's supposed to impart a sense of wisdom. And even after that service, I'm talking with other people in church, and they're processing of like, my gosh, I had never thought about how awesome this God is.
Yeah.
That he like, and they're then taking that case study and thinking along the line, how else does this apply? How else does this show us about how amazing this God is towards women? And
that's good.
Like point. That to me is like, that's the benefit of realizing Old Testament law is not really law, but is more of wisdom. And
right. That's why Proverbs is part of the law. Yeah. Here's how smart people live. Yeah.
And what you're saying, Ron, is just like, you know, what we're seeing here with Jesus and his relationship to the temple and the law. This is after the fact of when Jerusalem essentially met Athens. And the Ephesians, the Grecian thinking is that law is about legalistic law. And thus Jewish thinkers during this time, during the Second Temple period, they're trying to show, hey, Hebraic thought, Hebraic philosophy is just as good as Greek. And so we have laws too. Look at us. We're such an ordered society. Look at all the stuff that Moses wrote down, and trying to convince Grecians and also themselves that the law of the Old Testament is equal to the laws of the Greeks and the Romans. And so this is a part of what happens when you have cultures mixing and we sort of forget the original plot line.
Yeah, right. Well, with that, thank you. Yeah, let's get into it, and I think we'll probably agree more than we disagree on where this is going to go. But again, the beauty of this is we're doing it at the same, doing it spontaneously live. So let's do it. I'm going to read from John 2, starting in verse 13, for our story of the cleansing of the temple. The Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Again, it's a couple-day walk, at least, up, from Galilee, going up topographically, south, as it were, though, to Jerusalem. In the temple, he found those who were selling oxen and sheep and pigeons, and the money changers sitting there. We can read about this in Josephus and how the temple was made with this large area of, you couldn't bring sheep all the way from Galilee, so you'd come down and you would buy a sheep from as it were, a gatekeeper sitting in the large porticos around the temple area. Nothing wrong with that. This is just part of Jewish tradition. But watch what happens. Making a whip. Well, again, everyone knows what happened. So remember how we said last time that people who are reading this or hearing the story know the story orally well before it. So they're being reminded of how this works. And that's why the next verse presupposes you know why he did it. And making a whip of cords, he drove them all out of the temple, that large outside porticoed area where they were sitting, with the sheep and the oxen. It seems to be an ensuing chaotic scene of animals running and birds flapping and people running, with the sheep and the oxen. And he poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. Again, a scene of probably a lot of anger. He said, "Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of trade." And there's textual issues here, but this is from the synoptics. "My house shall be called a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of robbers." Now, let me pause there. That does seem to be a quotation from Jeremiah 7:11. Has this house, and this is exactly what Jeremiah was facing, where they were wanting the temple to be a symbol of Yahweh's presence at the end of the Old Testament era, 586-ish, that time period of Jeremiah. And the claim of the Jerusalemite in Jeremiah's day was Yahweh wouldn't let this place go because this is his house. So we're going to hang on to, as it were, the very pillars of this temple because Yahweh would never let his house be destroyed. And Jeremiah says, "Has this house, which is called by my name," quoting Yahweh, "become a den of robbers in your eyes? Behold, I myself have seen it, declares the Lord." What's interesting is that phrase, or that word for robbers there in Jeremiah 7 in Hebrew, peritz, is also used other places, about 6 or 7 other places in the Old Testament. And it's a more violent word than we sometimes think of a robber, where, in our modern world, we think of a robber being a guy with a mask, with a gun saying, "Give me all your money," because he doesn't want trouble. He just wants your money. In that world, it's a much more physical, with a knife and again, it's much more aggressive. Okay. So it's like in Ezekiel 18:10, if he fathers a son who is peritz, a robber, quote, "a shedder of blood," who does any of these things. The point being that peritz, translated as robbers in Jeremiah 7:11, is likely a much more aggressive term than just a passive thief. It's someone who's out to get you, to kill you. It's a very aggressive abominable term, in other words, so that when you hear Jesus use it in Jeremiah 7 or in John 2, he's quoting a text that's probably much more worse than it sounds in modern English. Don't make my house a den of robbers. Well, he's talking murderously wicked, this kind of thing. Just to finish the story, and then we'll talk about the temple. His disciples remembered later that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." So the Jews said to him, "What sign do you show us for doing these things? What right, what authority do you have to walk in here and basically take command of the temple area that is given to the selling of these animals?" Jesus said, "Destroy," and Jesus loves to give the cryptic answer to questions that have dual, maybe sometimes triple meanings. And here's one of them. "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I'll raise it up." The Jews then said, "Well, it's taken 46 years. It was begun in 20 BC, and now that's, we're probably 26 to 30, somewhere in the time period AD. So it's taken 46 years to build this temple. And will you raise it up in 3 days? Of course, they're mocking his point that he can raise it in 3 days. Of course, then it says in the next verse, he was speaking of the temple of his body. When he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered this, and they believed the scripture that the word and the word that Jesus had spoken. So it's not a miracle, but it is a sign. It is it's a enacted parable, shall we call it? Jesus wanted to teach something. How did he do it? He came into that temple during Passover, brimming with people and crowds and joyous, remembrance of God's big day for the Israelite people. And he turns the tables, as it were, literally, and says, "You have turned this place, which should be a place of Yahweh worship, into a den of murderous thieves." A violent reaction, again, by our Jewish Messiah, which is amazing that a Jew would do this to his own father's house, but we all now know why. Anything on the text itself before I get into our question, Mike?
I mean, I think also just it would be also helpful to clarify, where these money changers were, these traders, they did it within the courtyard of the Gentiles.
Right.
Right. It was the whole entire complex of the second temple was divided into these multiple courtyards, right? Where you had a courtyard of the women, a courtyard of the men, courtyard, eventually you get down to like the Holy of Holies, right? It gets more and more narrowed down. But the furthest out was the courtyard of the Gentiles, where God-fearers who are not Jewish, like a Cornelius, could come, supposedly, and worship the Creator in this courtyard. But by this time in Jesus' day, they decide, let's fill it up with animals. Let's fill it up with all this trade and marketplace. And to make it not a place of solemn worship, but into a place of money being exchanged. Right. And this is part of what fed into the anger and the indignation that Jesus is expressing here, because, and I think partly why there was a little bit of harmonization probably with some of the manuscripts where they tried to bring in the incident from the synoptics as well, because there is that line of, "This is my Father's house will be a house of prayer for the nations." That it's for combining where Jew and Gentile can worship the one Creator.
Yeah. Well, let me recommend, and you brought it up, so let me then, this is exactly where I was going. What was the status of the temple? Usually sermons that deal with this text properly, bring up the animals and the stench of the manure, and, that Jesus was antagonized by the sound of money changing and the smells of the animals. And he was thinking, oh boy, we should make this like a church, much more cleaner. We should get the animals out of here because this should be a solemn place of worship. And you've turned it into a noisy place of worship. I'd recommend, and here's where I'm going with this, it was much worse than that. And so I'm going to ask the question this way. What was the status of the Herodian temple during the days of Jesus. And again, a DCW always says, what did that crowd know at the time of the writing of the book? Number one, and I've made my points into just numbered points from my own organization. To answer the question, what's the status of the temple? Number one, externally, if you had walked up to the temple externally, the temple appeared to be dedicated to Yahweh, the God of Israel. Everyone thought that way. In other words, around the world, that's where Yahweh is worshipped. In other words, Jewish priests officiated. Now, they were imported from Egypt and Mesopotamia, but they were Jewish, legally. And Jewish sacrificial laws were apparently observed there. So again, from the outside looking in, you'd say this is Judaism at its finest. And as you just noted, Gentiles were restricted from entering the inner court. And Acts 21 gives the story of the suspicion that Paul brought a Gentile past that barricade that said, you pass this at your own peril. And in Acts 21, verse 28 and 9, Paul is almost killed himself as a Jew by Jews because he was apparently bringing a Gentile past that barricade. So in other words, externally, the point being, if I had looked at this scene, I would have said, this is Judaism 101. This is where you worship your God and you don't let Gentiles in because they're not part of the family. Okay? Historically, however, and here's where we have to go outside of the Bible, but we're expected to do this. Historically, however, Herod's relationship with Rome, Herod the Great, raised legitimate questions among Jews and raised legitimate questions among Jews about Roman imperial ideology and influencing the symbolism, architecture, and even the theology of the temple. What I mean by that is, yes, externally, I'd look at this and say, this is Yahweh's house. Beautiful. It glimmers in the sun, right? That's what Josephus said. But if I get into the nuts and bolts of what's going on, Herod the Great started this thing in 20 BC. He, has it made, it's still standing. Imagine making something that's still 2,000 years is still standing, part of it, right? The retaining wall to this temple is still there. That's the western wall that Jews are at today. But the point is, Herod was a scoundrel, and let's talk about that. And if you were a Jew, based on what you saw in that temple, that there is Roman ideology mixing into the temple itself. And here's what I mean by that. Number 3. We know this from Josephus. A large golden Roman eagle was set over the entrance to the temple, symbolizing the emperor, who was himself viewed in divine or semi-divine terms. And so, as again Josephus records, Judas and Matthias, 2 Jewish teachers outside of the Bible times, had led a protest to tear this eagle down, and Herod had them executed for this uprising. Here is, in fact, I'm going to quote from Josephus, his Antiquities of the Jews, Book 17. Now it happened that during the time of Herod's indisposition, he had the image of an eagle made of gold and placed it over the great gate of the temple. And then jumping ahead, but those who were zealous for the laws of their country pulled down the golden eagle with great violence and chopped it to pieces with axes. Well, that tells you where Herod's mind was when it comes to the God to whom he was dedicating the temple. That's what I'm thinking we need to do with this, is not say, well, Herod was a nice guy who just mistakenly put an eagle up there. He knew what he was doing. He was dedicating in his mind as the king of the Jews, the Roman delegate to keep the Jews in order, and he himself was half Jewish. I think he was doing this not on a whim. He was doing it because he wanted to, think DCW thoughts now, he wanted to honor the God of Rome in the person of the emperor, and he thus dedicated the temple to, and Jews knew it. That's the thing. Jews knew that when they were walking into the temple, this had been dedicated to the emperor. Here's another quote from Antiquities of the Jews, followed by a quote from the Wars of the Jews, just showing Herod's, his idolatry. And to Caesar, Herod dedicated the city, naming it Caesarea. Okay, out on the coast, 20 miles, 30 miles from Jerusalem, out on the coast is a city that we've unearthed now today called Caesarea. Well, hear the name there, Caesarea. He built, quote, a very costly temple of white stone, both on account of the beauty of the place and for the magnificent prospect. We don't know where that temple is. It's been destroyed. But Josephus continues, the temple was excellent and had in it a statue of Caesar, not inferior to any of the ancient statuary, and also one of the goddess Roma, from which we get the name Rome. So clearly, when he builds Caesarea, now you're getting into, again, more of the psychology of Herod. What God does Herod worship? Not Yahweh, clearly. He makes a temple, dedicates it to Caesar, and even puts inside of it a statue of the goddess Roma. One more quote from Josephus, again showing his idolatry. Herod also rebuilt Samaria, that's up north again, which had been destroyed. He gave it the name Sebast, from Sebastos, the Greek equivalent of Augustus. He built there a temple of Caesar, which was very sumptuous, it says in the Wars, or his book called The Wars of the Jews. All to say, when you add up what Herod was doing, I believe when it comes to the temple, well, let me say it this way. This then is what angered Jesus. This is my fourth point in my overview. What was the status of the temple? This, I think, is what angered Jesus. It was not the sound of animals. It was that Yahweh's house had been erected by a man who worshiped other gods and who went so far as to dedicate it to another deity. That's why it's a house of murderers. Okay, so now you might even want to think, I kind of wonder if Jesus meant house of deity murderers. In other words, murderers. These deities that you're worshiping, you don't know, are out to kill you. And that's what they do. And so Jesus was not just frustrated at the people. I think there were many honest people, frankly, in the temple just buying an animal that day. And they may have been confused by, why is Jesus so mad? And I think Jesus is much more than being motivated by the economy situation here. It's more of a theological, who is this dedicated to? So what do you think?
So, Ron, wouldn't it be fair, though, to say that despite how, and I get it, that Herod's motivations was not because he was a Yahweh worshiper. we all have known that. I just wonder, because also this is the same temple, right, where Mary and Joseph would dedicate Jesus in as well, mm-hmm. as a child, right, where they would pay the price of a couple of pigeons because that's all they could afford, mm-hmm. and offer as a sacrifice to honor, the Creator, essentially, for the gift of their son. Yeah. Right? And so I think we have to also be a little careful that despite its origins, it was a place and a location that was used in a manner that was meant to be directed as worship for Yahweh.
And I'll talk about that coming up, that, there is good use of the temple that we can find. Right. Yeah. So I agree.
I think it's just, it's a complicated history. It's not black and white. And that I do agree. I think the anger, yes, the deeper motivation, that is coming from this is that, the temple was not built because it was out of a zealous desire for Yahweh. It was about the greatness of being Jewish, mm-hmm. for Herod, and trying to make an overture to the people that he essentially helped to conquer, because he was part of what essentially suppressed and destroyed the rebellion of the Jewish people against Rome, and Herod was part of that. And as an overture to the people that he was now king over, I'm going to rebuild the temple. This is the irony, is that he destroyed what was originally built during Ezra and Nehemiah's day, only to rebuild it into something that is sumptuous, right. as Josephus would say.
Yeah. So you're making a good point, and I'm going to make it, coming right around the corner here, that, I'm thinking maybe I should just do it now. Let's do that. In fact, that's my next
Mhm.
course of discussion. So what was Jesus' relationship to Mosaic law? Now think outside of the temple, right? Let's put that one to rest. We saw Jesus go in and basically smash tables because he was mad. So now let's back up and ask a bigger question. So what was Jesus' relationship to Mosaic law? The whole concept of Torah in the days of, think Jesus' day. What was Jesus' relationship to Torah in his day? And let me give you the positive first, and then the yeah, but second, okay?
Mm-hmm.
The positive side, and this is commonly preached, was that there was good evidence that Jesus followed the law and demanded that other people follow the law as well. Right? We've heard this taught. I've heard it many times. In fact, I remember these discussions in my PhD works, the seminar work when I was in seminary. I don't think voices were raised, but definite argument ensued within the classroom from the teacher. And I remember I was one of the students that the teacher was against. I don't know how many were with me, but there was clear disagreement in the classroom that I took a certain view on this and the teacher didn't. So I have very fond memories, shall we say, of this being not just discussion, but argument. And that is, what was Jesus' relationship to the law? And by the time this is over, you'll hear my view. So let's start with the positive side. Evidence that Jesus both followed the law and required that others follow it as well. Number one, and you brought this up in one sense, or at least let's talk about it. In the story of the Jesus nativity scenes, we have a circumcision, Luke 2:21, and we have his presentation at the temple with the required sacrifices that this is in Luke 2, verses 22 through 24, that based on the economic situation of Joseph and Mary, they brought 2 turtle doves. And that really does match Leviticus, right? So the point is that a person could say that Jesus and his parents, at least, are following Levitical law, honoring the law by doing what the law demanded of a newborn child, circumcision and presentation at the temple. So fair enough. I'll put that right on the table. Yes, there is evidence right there that Jesus, or at least his parents, he didn't have much of a choice, but his parents certainly followed law. Number 2, again, I'm asking, what evidence is there that Jesus followed the law? Number 2, attendance at synagogue on Sabbath. This has been brought up as a reason to say, hey, wait a second, let's honor this now. Jesus went to the synagogue on the Sabbath, at least like in Luke 4:16, he shows up on the Sabbath. So could it be argued that if we were following Jesus week to week, I could predict that on Friday night, Sabbath starts, when sundown on Friday, I would have found Jesus at the synagogue, which had developed during the intertestamental period. As part of Jewish tradition, I would head off to synagogue on Sabbath. Yes, I think I would have, but again, notice that's not Levitical. There's no Levitical laws that require Sabbath worship. Sabbath was a day of rest, but between Leviticus and Matthew 1, Sabbath had turned into a day of worship as well. That's just Jewish tradition working through their history. I'm going to continue. Stop me if you want at any point, Mike. Another evidence that Jesus followed law would be his celebration of numerous Passovers and feasts. We have in John, in fact, is it 2, 5, 6, and 11, or 12, we have 4 Passovers mentioned at least by name or by inference. That's how we get a 3-year ministry of Jesus in our Life of Christ study, is we think in terms of the 4 Passovers into which Jesus places his ministry, John 2, 5, 6, and 12. And that's just the traditional way we do it. So the point being, if we can see Jesus going to Passover those 4 times, it would be understood that Jesus would be a faithful Passover journeyer from Galilee down into Jerusalem and doing the very thing that Deuteronomy said, show up at my house every Passover. So could it be, yes, number 3, celebration of Passover does show to some degree that Jesus respected and even followed the law. Number 4, Matthew 5:17-19 is a text in which, and we all know it, fulfilling, I have come not to destroy the law, and not one jot or tittle will be let go until it's all fulfilled. So that kind of teaching on the law is usually understood, and this is my fourth point, as defending Jesus' following law, that he taught the law's importance, if not its requirement. So that's usually how we take Matthew 5:17 to 19. I know you have comment on that coming up, and I'd love to hear it. But that's usually where we go with that Jesus would look into the eyes of his listeners and say, guys, I am here to help you follow law. Now, true, I have a view of the law that may be beyond what you're thinking, but I am here to fulfill / honor / obey. That's usually how it's taken, the law. Okay.
Would it be fair for me to just kind of share what my insight or to study from this?
One more. Okay. Let me do one more because, in fact, that would be a good jumping off point for you to push back. Okay. And that would be number 5. This is what I've heard again. Jesus at times commands people to follow the law. And that example of the leper that's healed in Matthew 8, he says, go to the priest, as though to say, well, take a look in your handbook. What do you do when you're healed? Well, you got to go down to the priest and be declared clean. So in other words, some have used, here's my 5th point, that some have said that Jesus follows the law. Here's the evidence. He told a leper to go to the priest. There it is. He's following the law. Also Matthew 23, where tithing of mint and cumin, he is applauding the Pharisees for what they do with the law. So there's another maybe evidence that Jesus both followed law and commanded others to do the same. So that's my 5. Yeah, if you want to, I think this would be a good time to kind of predict where I'm going to push back on some of this, and maybe you have some pushback as well.
So the Matthew 5:17, 19 is kind of where I want to just kind of hone in, if anything, from just a past study that I had done for a sermon series we did at my church. We know 5:17 a lot. Even some more famous pastors in the last couple of years have used this verse to justify the idea that we can unhitch or just basically jettison the usage of the Old Testament in the Christian faith, right? And it's because 5:17 says, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. And the irony is that some of these pastors would use the word fulfill to basically mean to abolish.
Yeah.
And when I was doing a study and I was getting ready for a sermon I was going to preach on this, one of the interesting things I realized was when you look at the standard Greek lexicon for the New Testament on the word fulfill, they have a note. And essentially when you go down to where would Matthew 5:17 appear within their semantic definitions, to them, the word fulfill in this context is the sense of fulfill as in fulfillment of a prayer. That even lists Matthew 5:17 as part of the evidence of how this word has been used as to mean fulfillment or an answer to prayer.
Yeah, fill that out for me. What you mean is I would use plerao, the Greek word there, to define or to be the example of how God answered a prayer of mine. He fulfilled it. Is that what you're meaning?
Yeah. And so one of the things that kind of occurred to me is that in many ways, it's almost as though the way that Jesus is talking about the law and the prophets is that the law and the prophets, imagine if they were in some sense a person, collectively a person praying for something, longing for something. He is the answer to that prayer.
Okay. That's cool.
He has come to answer that prayer of the law and the prophets. And so it's a very interesting kind of thought to view this as not so much of legalistic to-dos.
Yeah.
But like what in the end was the Old Testament law or, the Mosaic writings, the Torah, what was it trying to point people towards? And what was it essentially longing for? What was it desiring for the people of God as this was given to them?
Yeah.
Right. And if we're taking this collectively, like what we've been talking about when we were going through Genesis, is that this was about loyalty. This was about allegiance. This was like what Mike had said in his "What Does God Want?" family. Right. And so it's been an interesting journey for me to realize that to approach the law and the prophets, the Old Testament, as in many ways, like as though it was a person praying something, longing for something. And Jesus is actually the answer to that prayer.
And I love this. I mean, that idea, which I'd never heard until you told me, makes beautiful sense of, again, the woman of Samaria who is drawing water. I don't want to give away the story, but talk about an answer to a prayer. Here's a poor woman who, from all we know, is wishing she could honor the God of the Old Testament, and she's probably wondering how. And Jesus is the answer to her prayer. Well, I'm giving away that story, but thank you. And so let me grab the reins again and say it this way. This was the exact problem I had in my seminary. I gave not your answer, but something like that. I said, here's what I said in the class that caused basically the uproar, and my teacher became visibly upset. All those examples you just gave me, all 5 of those, every example of Jesus, quote, following law is suspect in my mind when considering that Jesus may simply have understood the law to be something other than what you think it is. In other words, if he understands the law to have a different purpose, he could still be doing those things, but not for the reason that you think he's trying to check off boxes on his Torah to-do list. Is that making sense? That, yeah, he was dedicated to the temple. Yeah, he told the leper to go to the temple. But those things to me, all 5 of those things, and I'm not aware of any others, don't really, to me, teach that Jesus followed in the sense of obeyed. Certainly he honored, but let's again be picky with our words. Did he literally obey every jot and tittle? I'd say that's, to me, it's still suspect. So now let me give you the other side and see again if this is again what I said in class, and I'm trying to remember exactly all my points, but this is my basic overview of what I had in a paper. Again, how these, I'm sure it's like your PhD work too, or your doctoral work, that you present your ideas to the group and they chew on them and then your teacher responds. So here's basically what I said to my class. Number 1, here's first evidence that Jesus did not follow strict observance to Jewish law, nor require it of any of his friends. Number 1, there's little evidence that Jews had been strictly observing Mosaic law since 586. The very thing that happened in 586 BC, the destruction of the temple, the deportation to Babylon, was the loss of Torah. You didn't have sacrifice, you didn't have a temple, you didn't have a priesthood. The very things that cause law to be law in the ritualistic sense, the legalistic sense, was now absent. So that's why they mishna'd their way. They decided, here's what we're going to do in place of sacrifice. We're going to give alms. Here's where prayer counts in replacement of sacrifice. And they came up with all these laws, these rules. The idea of a rabbi, the idea of a synagogue was all based on responsiveness to the destruction of the very thing they called, the ritual of Torah.
Have you ever read, he was a guest on Mike's old podcast, Dr. Seth Postel. He wrote a book called Reading Moses, Seeing Jesus. And I have it. And I forget what I always write in the preface what I think of a book. I'd have to pull it off the shelf and tell you what I think, what I thought. I don't know. At least one of the gems that I learned from that book was the realization that the oral law was basically used to override Mosaic written law. And
yeah, that's how Pharisees thought. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's just a fascinating thing to realize that in some sense they were trying to, it's like, well, it still applies even though we don't have a temple. And thus the oral law comes into play to help justify.
Yeah. Well, we do it all the time. I mean, I used to be more picky on the Pharisees than I am. And by the time we turn to John 3, by the way, in a podcast or two, I'm going to defend Nicodemus as a Pharisee. I think he was a good man. I think he was doing what we would have done if we were there. You'd be a Pharisee. That's just what you'd do. So, I'm going to, in the end, defend Pharisees as creating oral laws for the purpose of helping the family figure out how to act without a temple. That's what Pharisees did. And
yeah, I mean, to also, kind of spoil a little bit too. Like I've softened my stance on Pharisees as well, just because. I mean, I think when all the theological cards are on the table, I think one of the things I had to realize and just accept was that theologically, Jesus was closer to the theology of the Pharisees than he was to the Sadducees, the Essenes, the Zealots, and everyone else in between. Like they were actually closer in theological stances than anything, but they disagreed on certain things that also led to his demise.
Well, John 3 will be the one. Yeah, that's why we got to save that conversation for then. But yeah, you're right. I think Jesus would have fit. Some people have even said or surmised that Jesus was a Pharisee, but I don't see any evidence strictly of that. But yeah, okay. Well, let's let that one go. But let's just say, and I think this can be defended. This would take a whole series of discussions, but there is little evidence that Jews had been strictly observing Mosaic law since 586. And so here's the point. You can't bring Jesus and lay him over the book of Leviticus as though that's what they did. No, they didn't. They didn't do that. And I could, again, through history, show how much of what Leviticus has written, they were not following in the days of Jesus. They just weren't. And yet people, that's why you had Pharisees. That's why you had people who said, well, we don't have this stuff now, so here's how you're going to apply it. And yes, there were over pushes. There always is. But yeah, let's save that conversation in a sense for Nicodemus, I guess. Number 2, in the evidence of Jesus did not follow law, all previous examples, those 5 that I listed before, that are usually given for how Jesus followed law, all 5 of those examples to me may be attributable to simply observing familial custom. This is what the family does. We go to Passover. We was going to say castrate. I'm sorry. We circumcise our baby boys. We do these things not because Leviticus 12 says it. We do it because our Jewish family does it. So it's kind of like Thanksgiving at our house. We do it a certain way. She brings the beans. Susan makes the turkey. Why do we do that? Not because it's written down anywhere. We do it because it's our family custom. And if you were looking as an alien upon our Thanksgiving meal, you'd say, boy, these are law-abiding people. They do the same thing every year. No, we're not. We are simply a family that's gotten into a rut. And that rut is beautiful. We call it the Johnson family, Thanksgiving. And I'd say the same about the Jew. They did things out of a rut called the Jewish lifestyle, Judaism 101. And to attribute that to law, to me, is a mistake of just history and I think sociology even. So,
and I
do you
would
hear
say
my
that,
professor, by the way, starting to
well,
react to me in the classroom? I mean, yeah, this is where he jumped in and said, "No, you're off your rocker."
Well, I think is part of it's difficult for us because we're Gentiles, and we would look at this and we would think, again, because of our Protestant backgrounds, it's law, and law is a bad thing. That's what Jesus came to destroy the law, and so, but he had to fulfill the law first before he destroyed the law, right?
And so I know that's where this goes. Usually, he had to fulfill it by obeying it, and I'd say no. You don't have to obey it to fulfill it.
But what we often forget is that if you live with a certain kind of standard for a long time, going multiple generations, it eventually, like, where's the divide where law or written ideas eventually merge and just get absorbed into what we now call culture?
Right.
Into a family's culture, into an ethnic identity or ethnic culture. Like for me, like I'm ethnically Chinese, and yet I am born and bred Bostonian, Red Sox Nation, all that in my blood. And yet, Revolutionary War, Boston Tea Party, but all of this in the end, like there are still things that I do as a person because of my ethnic background, because of the family I grew up in. When Lunar New Year comes, it's even weird for me to say Lunar New Year because the way I grew up, it was always Chinese New Year. That the day before or the days before Chinese New Year, I would get into this routine of let's make sure we clean the house. Why? Because you want to make sure that everything impure or unclean is technically excised out from the house.
Interesting.
But that had just simply boiled down to simply, it's nice to have a clean house on New Year's Day. It's nice to get rid of all the dust bunnies before New Year's Day.
Yeah, nothing wrong with that, right?
There's nothing wrong with it. And for me, in particular, my particular ethnicity and dialect group, for a long time, like I have not met any other Chinese folks who are more recent who actually observe this custom. But one of the first things on Chinese New Year Day, my family used to eat only vegetables in the morning. And the reasoning that was given to me was, well, you don't want to start off the new year by killing an animal.
Okay.
You don't want to shed any blood at the very beginning of New Year's Day. And so we would have a meal together, but it would be all vegetables, mushrooms, veggies, rice, but no meat until later that night when you would eat a baked, wok chicken, right? And that's just custom. I shared this with other friends who are also Chinese or Asian, and they all look at me baffled because their family had never done that custom. Mm-hmm. But that was the custom I grew up in, and I still carry that a little bit with me and my wife on Chinese New Year.
Sounds fair. And so, and that's my argument about Jesus. I think we could say that what he was going through, again, I can see pushback, but this is my position, this is my opinion, that everything Jesus does that looks like he's fulfilling law or following law, obeying law, was just what a Jew would do. And he's fine with that, just like you would be fine with eating vegetables, even though you know it's not part of law. Number 3 in my list. Far from observing Sabbath. Again, when someone says he observes Sabbath, I would say, did you read the Bible? I'm sorry, but Jesus seemed to wait for Sabbath to annoy people. In one of the, I forget where this is, somewhere in Matthew, I think it is. It goes from Sabbath and it skips 6 days to Sabbath and it skips 6 days to Sabbath. That's the argument of this book that supposedly Matthew's often thought of as, the legalistic book, the Jewish book. I'd say, no. It's a believer in Jesus who's trying to show, I think, that the law was Jesus. Well, how do I say this positively? Let me say it this way. Far from observing Sabbath, Jesus waited for Sabbath to try to show the foolishness of what Sabbath had become. Okay. So, number 4, Jesus actually redefined what Sabbath meant. And here's where it's interesting. Let me just throw it out here, Mike. I had not heard this till, a couple months ago. In Aramaic, when you say son of man, you almost always mean human. And so when Jesus said, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath in Mark 2:28, he said in Aramaic, he probably meant, I'm looking at human beings who are in charge of the Sabbath. The Son of Man is Lord of Sabbath, meaning humankind. You are the Lords of Sabbath. You are actually, and boy, this makes sense to me. Go back to the garden. You are in charge. You are always meant to be in charge. I made you to be in charge, even of that 7th day that is now, it's codified in Exodus 20. But I think Jesus is looking with this longing in front of the Matthew 2 or the Mark 2 crowd saying, guys, if you had just known, please go back to the garden and realize you were made to be lords of everything, or at least, in charge of the world, including the 7th day. So I just think Jesus would have really annoyed the average Sabbath worshiper who was following oral law. That would have been a huge annoyance, and it was, right? However, if you had been and I wish I had been, I hope that if I had been there, I would have been mature enough to think with Jesus and say, you're right. Wait a second here. I get to do things on Sabbath because I'm the Lord of Sabbath. I was made to be in charge of this day because I get to rest. I call the shots. That's what Jesus actually meant by it. So jump in.
Well, I'm curious because as I'm looking at Mark, right, there is the article. So it's not a son of man, it's the Son of Man. And so
right. But in Aramaic, in other words, if you were to take the original statement that Jesus made, I forget the commentary I was reading on this, where he showed in Aramaic how it would come across as the human being.
So I would say I agree with that if we're doing a theological retrieval of going up one or two layers.
Yeah.
And like why I would agree with it is because yes, Sabbath, well, really, like even when we look at the Genesis 1 and chapter 2 account, you get this idea that ultimately by the time we get to the end of creation after day 6, and day 7 is when Yahweh, essentially when the creator rests, it's not so much a resting in the ancient Near Eastern mindset of like you just kicking your feet up and enjoying your couch, but that he's resting as a king would rest, or a god would rest in his or her temple, meaning everything is now in order. Everything is organized the way it should be. Everything is in its proper place. So now the God can rest in the temple because now the God is ruling. Right. The God is now exercising his power and authority and reign. Right. And so I can understand what you mean about humanity ultimately being lords of the Sabbath in the sense of when everything is in its proper order. And I got to experience this in Israel with a family that was doing Sabbath. That, once everything is in proper order and on Sabbath, you get to rest in a sense that you get to rejuvenate, but everything's in its proper place now. There is a sense of rulership of like, our
you get to do whatever you want.
Yeah.
Isn't that cool? Yeah.
So I get what you mean, but I think it's interesting that in the Greek that it has the article as though it's like, yes, Jesus as the Son of Man, as the ultimate representative of humanity. Oh yeah, Lord of the Sabbath.
And I remember this happening in the seminar I was in that caused again some grievance. I said, "Do you think? Okay, so Jesus is Lord of Sabbath. We all know that. He says he is. What if I had been standing next to Jesus and say, can I do that too? Can I do what you're doing on Sabbath?" I think Jesus would, with a wink, say, that's the point. I'm doing it because I want you to do it. In other words, he's not reserving for himself a view of Sabbath or what he can do. He's trying to hand it off. He's saying to all his followers, you have no idea, because of your traditions, how joyous this day should be. You've turned it into something it was never meant to be. So anyway, Thank you. Number 5, evidence again that Jesus did not follow law. Number 5, Jesus touched a leper, Mark 1, which was strictly forbidden, Leviticus 13:45. You don't do that unless you want to become unclean. So Jews don't touch lepers. Jesus then reaches out and touches a leper. To me, and by the way, I think he did that looking around saying, watch this, guys, watch what I'm about to do. Boom, he touches a leper. And it's like my 2.5-year-old granddaughter. I forget the story here, but mom said, don't touch it. So she looks right at mom, making sure mom sees her, and goes and, you guessed it, touches it. It's like you're doing it to make a point. And I think he touches this leper both out of compassion and also to show, if I had touched him, the leper, as Jesus' follower, do you think you would have been mad about that? See, that's what I've heard. And even in the class, I remember a guy said, well, when Jesus touched the leper, he could do it because he's holy and he would make the leper clean and the leper wouldn't make him unclean. And I said, so you think if I had touched the leper with Jesus, Jesus would be mad at me? I forget the answer, but it was like, come on. Jesus is trying to do in front of people what he wants everyone to do, I believe. And he wanted all of us to walk up and touch that leper that day, because I don't think he felt that Leviticus 13 had any calling on him at that point, based on, again, the trajectory of Scripture. Number 6, Jesus allowed a ritually unclean woman to touch him. I won't spend any time on it. Same story. A ritually unclean woman, Mark 5, verse 25, touches him, and Leviticus 15 says, no, you don't do that. Number 7, Jesus forgave sins without requiring animal sacrifice at the temple. If you want to compare that story again, Mark 2, the guy's lowered through the roof, your sins are forgiven. Leviticus 4, verse 20 and on, that's how you do it. The priest does it. You got the dabbing of blood, the atonement ritual, the forgiveness of sins. That whole story of Leviticus 4 should have been played out. If you're playing it strictly, Jesus undoes that Leviticus 4 story in Mark 2. And I think the whole point is he looks around saying, isn't this cool? Isn't it cool what I can do that's not following Leviticus 4? Number 8, Jesus declared all, this is a big one to me, and I don't see how we get around this. Jesus, quote, declared all foods clean in Mark 7:18 and 19, challenging the very idea of kosher. And it says it right there in Mark, he declared all foods clean. That is a clear breaking of Mosaic law, and the text has no problem saying it. Number 9, Jesus contradicted Torah, I believe, on the adulterous woman story. John 8, we'll get to it, so we won't spend time here. But when she's thrown down in front of the group, Leviticus 20, verse 10, Deuteronomy 22:22, both say the adulterous woman and the other man who's adulterous should die. But that's the point. She is deserving of death. And I think Jesus is saying basically, guys, we're not under Torah. You know that. So I'm going to go down the way of forgiveness because I think she's a loyalist, and I'll argue that when we get there. So in other words, I just think that whole adulterous woman story is, again, another proof.
Well, also, I would say that even that whole incident in John 8, they were not even following the Torah exactly as well. They were selectively following it just for the woman. But what happened to the man? Right.
And Jesus doesn't go down the path of legality at all. He goes down the path of love and forgiveness and so forth and so on. So, it's part of our study to come. Number 10, Jesus reinterpreted numerous aspects of Torah in the Sermon on the Mount. Remember this one where he says, you've heard it said, but I say unto you. Sometimes he's going to say things that I think are clearly going, if you think it, you've started on the path of doing it, right? Well, that's not in the law. It doesn't say you can't lust in the law. And Jesus says, don't lust. Well, what he means is you guys are thinking legally. I'm thinking practically. If you live your life lusting, you're going to break adultery law. I know you will. That's how adultery starts. So you know what I want you to do? Don't lust. That's a wise way of looking at Torah that they maybe had. And I think some of the Hillel and Shammai kind of conversation back and forth had come up with the idea, I forget the quotes, but they had come up with the general concept that if you don't think it, you won't do it. The fence laws idea. And I think Jesus is just playing off that, saying, guys, you are so given to law. Frankly, what God always wanted was people who don't even think down those paths. Number 11, just 2 more. Jesus associated with Gentiles. That's a big one. And now that's all over the place. We'll have it in John and so forth. So let's keep that one for future discussion. But think of this. He associated with Gentiles, inviting them into Abraham's family while staying Gentile. That's against Torah. In Torah, you have to proselytize. Jesus will have none of that. He will talk to the Samaritan woman coming up in chapter 4, inviting her into the family, staying Samaritan. That's against law, and I don't know how in the world people can argue against that, so let's save that conversation for John 4. My last one, again, to me it's right in the text. Jesus invited everyone to realize that God, quote, desired mercy and not sacrifice, Matthew 12:7, quoting Hosea 6. All along. I think he's looking at the crowd saying, guys, if you had just known Hosea 6 in what it meant, you wouldn't be doing what you're doing now. And that quote, again, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, means, well, what does it mean? I don't need Leviticus. I know it's there. I know you're all excited about killing your next animal, but I don't need that. And so we've been through that in the Genesis study, but you can see how those 12 points, when I made them in class, excited the teacher.
I can see. And okay. I mean, and I've said this here with you before as well. I think sometimes we as Protestants or evangelicals, we keep on carrying the legacy and the emotional baggage of Martin Luther, right? Where like a lot of our theology is defined through his eyes because of his angst against what he perceived as law. But the interesting tension balance of Jesus fulfilled the law, but then at the same time he abolished the law, and we go back and forth, and we forget that even in the Second Temple period, you had Jewish sects and different groupings that were all trying to ultimately answer the question: well, why is it that God exiled us to Babylon in the first place? Why were we sent away? And one of the answers ultimately was because we weren't keeping the Sabbath. We weren't following the Levitical laws.
I just think
we weren't following the Torah exactly. And that was one major group of thinking. And then others like, oh, it's because we didn't do this or we didn't do that. We need to go out to the desert and be completely pure because we didn't get the right priests at the temple now. But everyone had an answer to why the exile happened. And part of the reason why my position and my view on the Pharisees have softened over the years is because I came to the realization that the Pharisees themselves were really reacting out of the fear. We don't want to be exiled again.
Right.
And so we have to do something to make sure the nation does not be destroyed again. Even in John, we're going to see where someone does say, it's better to sacrifice one man for the nation, right? Because ultimately they were all worried about having another exile. And
I'm not sure where to bring this into the study of John. I've looked ahead in the gospel to think, where should we talk about the new perspective on Paul? Because that is so big to this story of where Judaism was at the time. I don't know of a good place to put it in. I think John 7 might be a possible spot, but what you're talking about there, the softening of your view on the Pharisees, for me, that happened by my Old Testament study when I was doing my dissertation, that David, for example, in the Psalms was completely devoted to law without feeling like he had to be perfect. And that idea struck a chord in me that then I took it into, well, how come then in our Reformed thinking we have to have someone fulfilling perfection behaviorally in order to pay for my sins? And that's where it started to fall apart for me. And I'm thinking if David could be right with God, forgiven, and not behaviorally perfect, that means follow my logic here. Jesus probably walked into a world that had lost that view of the beauty of what David knew. That's where I was coming from without even reading E.P. Sanders. Well, then later, again, this is about 2010-ish or so in my life, I finally get around to reading N.T. Wright, New Perspective on Paul's Stuff, E.P. Sanders, and I realized that what they're saying and what Sanders wrote in 1977, the book that, changed the landscape on how to interpret Pharisaism, to bring your point back into it, and this is Sanders now, don't be so hard on what Jews were doing in the days of Jesus. Most of them were actually trying to honor the God of Israel, who, they got kind of stuck on the fence laws. But if you had really interviewed, and now what he's doing is talking a Nicodemus in my mind. He's a guy who actually is an honest inquirer. And most Pharisees, this is Sanders' view, were honest inquirers. Now, again, we have them from the bad side, the view, Jesus, excoriating them. But from the Josephus side, they were very nice people. And again, where do we talk about this? I'm not sure, but if you, the listener, haven't read or gotten involved in the New Perspective on Paul, at least be familiar with it, because a lot of the stuff we're talking about here, what you're saying, Mike, gets into this view of what was Judaism like in the days of Jesus, really, not just from some of the, the yelling and screaming that went on between Jews and Jesus in Matthew 23. Fair enough there, but I'm just saying that to be fair to the story, as Sanders was trying to do in 1977, it really does adjust how we should view Judaism. Sorry about that diatribe, but that's something that's just on the side of the book of John that we don't really have a text to drive us into it.
Yeah, I think I don't know where I really stand on the New Perspective on Paul. To me, it's just I want to dig into the research and understanding the context of the time. And that's whole entire thing about even we're going to be talking about the Samaritans, and the Samaritans come up a bit. Even recently, just me reading the book by George Athos on Bridging the Testaments and realizing again, it comes back down to that question of why were we exiled? And also an adjacent question, which is, well, who's really Jewish?
Right.
What counts as being Jewish? And thus, in the end, one of the ways the Samaritans became the Samaritans and defined as Samaritan and not as part of Judaism or being part of the Jewish family was because of this crazy time period where they were trying to figure out questions. Why were we exiled? How do we prevent our exile? Who's really Jewish? Because there were a bunch of people left behind that were not exiled, but they interacted with other Gentiles. So are they still Jewish? Are they not Jewish? They were asking all these cultural questions that we as Gentile, Protestants and people who come to the text 2,000 years later, we're not even asking. We're not even aware that these are questions.
So let's save let's rekindle this conversation as we go through John, because, in any podcast, frankly, because this to me is part of the DCW. It's trying to think in terms of the original audience and writer, and that's what the new perspective is asking. It's not going to Luther asking what he thought of the Pope. A lot of Reformed theology is based on Luther being concerned about where the Pope and the Catholic Church was. Paul never met Luther. He never met a Pope. So that's where the new perspective is saying, let's recalculate how Paul would have meant or understood law compared to how Luther would have. That's just that's the big overview. But to land the plane today, let's finish it up. Just a few more points then. Well, let me summarize where I'm done or where I've gone, and I'll let you make the last word then. What was Jesus' relationship to Mosaic law? What did we learn out of Jesus walking into the temple, John 2, cleansing it, making a mess for the day? They probably straightened. I've always wondered, what did they do the next day? Well, they put their table back up and went about their duties, right? So everything was pretty quick, and it was over before they knew it. And Jesus goes back to his life. The temple goes back to its life. So it was kind of an enacted parable, but that didn't have any lasting effect from what we know. So here are my last 3 points then in summary. What was his relationship to Mosaic law? Number one, there exists no firm evidence that Jesus followed a strict observance to Mosaic law, nor demanded it from anyone. That's my call. I realize it, but that's where I am based on what I'm seeing in the text. Number two, the Gospel of John, those of us going through now this study, invites us to prepare. This is fascinating to me. Invites us to prepare to meet a Jewish Messiah who operates completely outside of Torah tradition. I mean, that sounds so counterintuitive. If anything, I'm going to expect a Jewish Messiah to do is act Jewish. Play up to the family traditions. And what Jesus will do, and now, again, those of you who know Jesus and have followed and read the Gospels, this, I hope, makes perfect sense. Yes, I'm seeing a guy who loves Yahweh desperately, who loves his Jewish friends and even Gentiles desperately. Putting all that together, he's going to downplay the law and upplay loyalty. That's exactly, again, where Mike went with that What Does God Want book. So, in Luke 19:10, for the Son of Man came to seek and to save the Jewish family. That's what the Jewish Messiah comes to do, right? No, the lost. I'm going to recommend when we get to John 13, verse 34, when he says, a new commandment, he's got Gentiles in the room. That's not to me said during Passover. That's said a week before Passover in the house of Simon. John 12. So save that conversation for later. But when he says a new commandment I give you, we've always wondered what mean new. Of course, we're supposed to love everybody. That's Leviticus 19. No, he's saying for the first time, I think in recorded history, as a Jewish Messiah, I want you, Jew, to love you, Gentile. I want there to be an inter-family relationship that is so harmonious that it blows the world's mind. And you both can do this through loyalty to my Father and me. So that's where I think this is going to go in the book of John. It all starts in John 2, where he overthrows the temple, the tables, and then he walks away. So it's over before it starts almost, right? But the story is inviting us to say, if we had left the story at this point, again, as a listener to the book, we'd walk out of the room saying, I wonder how Jesus is going to handle the law. This story kind of concerns me, right? And I think, and I'm giving away where I think this is going, he is going to day by day dismantle law, Levitically, ritually, and replace it with the very thing God has wanted since Genesis 2. Loyalty. Love me. Don't worship other gods. Worship me and everything will be fine. So I'm done. Any thoughts as we close?
No, I think, it comes back down to simply, I think, as we had done during the Genesis conversation, what God wants has always been a family, right? Mm-hmm. And ultimately, I guess the way I would try to propose, right, is some people might get upset about like, well, does this mean Mosaic law has no relevance? I would just push back and simply say that no, there is a relevance. It gives us an insight and a hint when we take into account of the culture of the time when it was written, the things that God values. And so you learn about who this God is by trying to figure out what are the things that he values, what are the things he wants his family to avoid from doing.
Yeah, well said.
And so I think when basic comprehension ultimately comes down to, well, when you read it for the first time, you only have literal meaning because you have no cultural context. You don't know the background story. You don't know what's going on. But I think as we become more and more familiar with the culture and the context of when the law was written, of where and when was it given, and then eventually how even that understanding was lost and then eventually morphed into this understanding that we see in the New Testament, that everything you're saying, it makes sense. Jesus is actually trying to get down to what at the core was this, set of instructions that Moses ultimately was given for the people of Israel, was so that they could figure out who their God is, what their God is like, and what are the things that this God loves and cares about, because they're part of his family and they ought to emulate their father.
And I think we all could, thank you for that. And let's close with that thought that someday when you sit with your family at a, Thanksgiving or a Chinese New Year, whatever you're doing as a family, you're looking around the room and what are you celebrating? Not law-keeping things, people. You're celebrating family. And that, now define that can be tricky because you got in-laws, you got outlaws, right? You've got people you don't even sometimes like, but they're in the room, they're family, and there's something different about that than there is people who keep laws. And if you can define what a family is, again, welcome to the New Testament. Here's where Peter and Paul disagreed. Define the family. But that's the fuel that runs the New Testament. And it's the fuel, frankly, that Mike caught it in that, what does God want book? And this is, I think, where the DCW is going. That's why I want to democratize this view to every denomination, every church in the world. You can have a DCW worldview and keep your denominational distinctives, because what we're talking about here is simply looking at the text from the biggest vantage point. He wants a family. How does he get there? Yeah, we're going to disagree. But the tent's big enough to have those disagreements. So again, as we close, if you have questions, we have set up a questions and comments. We will be putting together a Q&A podcast soon. And if you have questions for us, send them to, here's the email address, questions.dcwp, as in Divine Counsel Worldview Podcast, questions.dcwp@gmail.com. And Mike will be curating that website and pulling questions, and and comments too, if you'd like to, and putting together a Q&A podcast coming up. So anything else, Mike? Can we close down the cleansing of the temple?
I think so. I think
everything went back to normal the next day. And everything went back to normal the next day. That's what I wrote after verse 22. So, All right. Next time we'll be again finishing up John 2. But again, thank you, everyone. Until then, we'll talk to you then, and may God bless you richly.